Hey there! My name is Chroma, and welcome to part 2 of making an abstract adventure. So, last time we had began to set up the environment for our prototype test level thing, as well as made a decent amount of progress on our player, being able to move, jump, double jump, and fall, and test if we're in contact with the ground. As well, we set up the camera a bit to basically just follow the player in a very simple manner. This time, we've made a lot more progress with our environment here, as well as set up some fancy tricks with our camera, sort of reworking it to follow the player better and smoother, as well as having these focus objects where, actually I guess I'll just show it off. We can basically, when we enter a trigger field, we will not be able to move anymore. The camera will pan over to an object to show it off, and it can change the zoom, and then it goes back to the player, and then we can move again. This also has public variables for like the times that each of those things happen. So on this one over here, we can have it zoom in and also do it immediately, and then come back and we gain control again immediately. As well, a Boolean for it being like a one-time event, or so this one, it doesn't zoom in anymore, but this one, it does every time we pass it. So now we have that. So, and these objects are just random things to kind of focus on, I guess. So let's show how all that's working. First of all, with our environment, these are just on our background empty game object here, just having a bunch of circles that are tinted, and yeah, we have that. And then the foreground has these floor tiles. So theoretically, if they were up here, the player would go behind them, but these clouds, the player would go in front of them. And potentially we could make some usefulness out of that in our levels. Like we could have something that because the player goes behind it, the user can't see the player, and then we could, I don't know, do stuff with that later. But we'll see when we get there. So for now, on our focused, actually I'll go to the camera first. So our camera, we have like a smoothing value, a height offset, the zoom, and the zoom smoothing. So if we change the zoom for whatever reason, then sort of the smoothing of it doing that. So let's have a look at that. So our camera follow over here, very different than when we last looked at it. Here we have a bunch of public hide and inspector variables that the camera focused scripts make use of. We'll get to those when we do that, like when we look at that script. As well, we have some private variables here for the move position, which is sort of the same thing as it was before. A cam velocity that, actually a zoom velocity and a cam velocity that they aren't used, but they're needed for the functions that we'll be using, as we will get to down there. A reference to the player and to the camera. The actual like camera component, so we can access the zoom, which is just the size on the orthographic camera. That is, on the camera, it's this. So just calling it zoom, so it's more obvious of what it is as a public variable. Then in the awake, getting a reference to all of those things. Setting the zoom as such. Then if this target variable is nothing, meaning we should be following the player, then instead of using, I believe before I used vector3.lerp, their linear interpolation, change that to smooth damp. It just worked a lot better, and it just looks better in terms of being smooth with following the player. And then these numbers are basically the same as they were before, but here then we needed this camera velocity in here. That's the only place it gets used, but it's not used for anything else. And then if the target is not null, meaning it's something, we have a target set, then we follow that target instead, which can also have a height offset, but in both those examples they weren't used, but that's there in case we eventually use it. And then also having the zoom slowly go towards what it should be. Then we have, once we calculate that move position, then setting it to the transform. All right, next on our camera focus scripts, we have a bunch of public variables, as we saw in the inspector, for the target set, the smoothing for going to this target, and the offset height, and the zoom smoothing. Those are kind of the equivalents of these variables here, and this will basically, the script will, when the player enters that trigger to kind of activate it, it will access the camera follow and set these values to these ones. But different objects that we might be temporarily targeting will have different values for all of this stuff, as we saw with our two examples. So that's why they're separated like that. So then we have more variables for the start delay of, so when we disable the player's movement, a little bit of a delay before we actually pan over to the object, then how long we're panned over to the object, and then panning back to the player, and then maybe waiting a second before we give them the ability to move again. And then also Boolean for whether it only happens once or not. If it's set to true, then it'll destroy the trigger once this whole thing is done. Otherwise, it'll maintain existing. So yeah. Then getting references to the camera follow and to the circle main so that we can disable the circle's ability to move. Then in awake, we get a reference to both of those objects. And then in our onTrigger enter event, then we start this coroutine to do the change target stuff. So first of all, just by accessing the circle main script and setting it enable to false, that will prevent all of these scripts from running. And yeah, so yes, then the player won't be able to move and all of that. As well, over, where is it? Yeah, accessing the player move, it also has a separate active state that on enable and on disable we set to false. We'll get to that in a minute, but for now, then we have a delay for the start delay. Then we access all the variables on the camera follow script and set them to these variables in this script, and setting the target to something that isn't null will then activate this Boolean being the opposite. So we'll run this code instead of this code. So we will then follow these targets instead of the player as such. So there's that. Then we wait for the focus time, and then we set the target to null, which will make it go back to following the player, and then wait for the end delay, and then setting it to true. And then if it was a one-time thing, then we destroy this game object so that it won't happen again. So it will only be a one-time thing. Then over on our circle main with our player move over here. And one other change that has been made. This is a little bit longer now because using the front right variable that we made before, I've now made it that when we change directions, first of all, there's a calculation for this. So if we were moving right and this front right is false, meaning the front direction is left, then it's changing the front direction to right. So actually acknowledging the fact that we're changing direction, so that variable is being kept track of. As well, we test whether we're grounded or not and then do some calculations here. Basically, this is making it so we turn around a bit snappier as opposed to how it was before. And how I've gone about doing that is basically if we are grounded, this calculation here that calculates the move direction and does that, I'm basically making it happen twice to sort of basically just move the other way faster. That's if we're grounded. If we're in the air, setting it to 0 and then doing one of these calculations basically makes it even faster, even snappier, so we can turn the other direction even faster if we're in the air. So we just have better air control that way. But then if we're on the ground, it's still snappier than it was before, but just slightly not as much. And then for going the other direction, it's the exact same thing, just reversed. So we have that. As well, we have stuff in this move function, as well as stuff in this update function. So this basically makes it so that if this script is not active, if our active variable that we have up here is set to false, then we'll basically be slowly moving to 0, kind of similar to this code that we have over here, except this move script won't be running if the circle main is disabled. So we basically have a separate thing here of, instead of the player just snapping to not moving, they have that slow decrease to being stopped, just so it looks a bit nicer there. All right, so that covers all our code there. Over here we have these focus test objects, which are basically just big trigger colliders, and they have all these variables that we talked about over in here. So we can easily change these numbers and, yeah, do all of that in action. Oh, as well, the circle character, I added a bit of detail to that as well. So you can see that our movement left and right is a bit snappier and more so in the air. If we touch this thing, we get stopped, wait a second, pan over to the object, wait more seconds, and then go back, wait even longer, and then we gain control of the player again. So we have all of that working as we want it to. Eventually, something I just thought of is if we have enemies on screen, we might want to disable them as well to do those so we're not getting damaged. But again, we'll figure that out once we actually start to make more of that stuff. One last thing that I've made over in the prefabs is I started to make the our other character that we're going to be having, our cube character, which at the moment has the exact same functionality as our sphere character. I'm just going to move that a bit aside and hit play. In a second, I'm going to drop. So at the moment, it's kind of controlling both, but that's not how it's going to be in the actual game. Oh, and now we have that. Cool. So we have this. Messing with values. They have slightly different speeds and stopping values and being able to jump ever so slightly differently. I'll decide more so once we actually start making levels for both of them, how different they will be, or we might make them exactly the same. We'll, figure that out. As well, this cube character does have a circle collider similar to our circle character, just because that will work better with if we have slopes and stuff. I think it'll just be, or slight inclines. Those collisions will just work a bit better if we have a circular collider, I think. But again, more stuff to potentially get changed when we get there. As well, this will be replaced by having like a square main script. When we start to program more of their differences, like one being able to wall jump, this one being able to do some kind of bounce attack thing, or whatever normal enemy attacks that they have, that will be when they start to be more different. But for now, I can delete this one, and we're just gonna only be sticking with Cal for now. Oh, as well, this one's name is Q, because it's gonna be Q Lee, kind of like QB, I guess. That's the pun there. And it'll be some kind of like martial artist type of thing. Still working out most of that. I don't want to necessarily say ninja. That sounds a little... I like a synonym for that, but something like that. So we have a knight and a ninja type person. All right, so that's where that's going. So that'll do it for this development log. Next time, I think I'm going to be working on a basic attack and then start to work in hazards, health, work towards that sort of stuff. Then, once we have everything that'll be on both characters done, then we will start to make the stuff that'll be on just the sphere character and just the cube character. But for now, that'll be it for this episode. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you around.